Indonesia's transition to the new order in the mid-1960s ousted the country's first president, Sukarno, after 22 years in the position. One of the most tumultuous periods in the country's modern history, it was the commencement of Suharto's 31-year presidency. Described as the Great Dalang, Sukarno drew power from balancing the opposing and increasingly antagonistic forces of the army and Indonesian Communist Party. By 1965, the PKI extensively penetrated all levels of government and gained influence at the expense of the army. On 30 September 1965, 6 of the military's most senior officers were killed in an action by the so-called 30th September Movement, a group from within the armed forces. Within a few hours, Major General Suharto mobilized forces under his command and took control of Jakarta. Anti-communists, initially following the army's lead, went on a violent purge of communists throughout the country, killing an estimated 500,000 people and destroying the PKI, which was officially blamed for the crisis. The politically weakened Sukarno was forced to transfer key political and military powers to General Suharto, who had become head of the armed forces. In March 1967, the Indonesian parliament named General Suharto acting president. He was formally appointed president 1 year later. Sukarno lived under virtual house arrest until his death in 1970. In contrast to the stormy nationalism, revolutionary rhetoric, and economic failure that characterized the early 1960s under the left-leaning Sukarno, Suharto's pro-Western New Order stabilized the economy but continued the policies of Pancasila. Background: nationalist leader Sukarno had declared Indonesian independence in 1945 and was appointed president. Following an internal national revolution and struggle against the former Dutch colonial government, Sukarno had managed to hold together the disparate country. However, his administration had not been able to provide a viable economic system to lift its citizens out of severe poverty. He stressed socialist policies domestically and an avidly anti-imperialist international policy, underpinned by an authoritarian style of rule dependent upon his charismatic personality. Pursuing an independent Indonesian foreign policy, Sukarno developed friendly ties with the Eastern Bloc, the People's Republic of China, whilst courting friendly relations with the United States. At the same, in his effort to maximize Indonesian bargaining power in its foreign policy, Sukarno was also a pioneering figure in developing the non-aligned movement, playing a lead role in hosting the Bandung Conference in 1955. In Indonesia's domestic politics, Sukarno also carefully balanced Indonesia's various political parties, including the PKI. From the late 1950s, political conflict and economic deterioration worsened. By the mid-1960s, the cash-strapped government had to scrap critical public sector subsidies. Estimates put annual inflation at 500 to 1,000%. Export revenues were shrinking, infrastructure crumbling, and factories were operating at minimal capacity with negligible investment. Severe poverty and hunger were widespread, and Sukarno led his country in a military confrontation with Malaysia while stepping up revolutionary and anti-Western rhetoric. Described as the Great Dalang, President Sukarno's position came to depend on balancing the opposing and increasingly hostile forces of the army and the PKI. His anti-imperial ideology saw Indonesia increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union and China. By 1965, at the height of the Cold War, the PKI penetrated all levels of government extensively. With the support of Sukarno in the Air Force, the party gained increasing influence at the expense of the army, thus ensuring the army's enmity. By late 1965, the army was divided between a left-wing faction allied with the PKI, and a right-wing faction that was being courted by the United States. Military split these same policies, however, won Sukarno few friends and many enemies in the Western world. These especially included the United States and United Kingdom, whose investors were increasingly angered by Sukarno's nationalization of mineral, agricultural, and energy assets. In need of Indonesian allies in its Cold War against the Soviet Union, the United States cultivated a number of ties with officers of the military through exchanges and arms deals. This fostered a split in the military's ranks, with the United States and others backing a right-wing faction against a left-wing faction overlapping with the PKI. When Sukarno rejected food aid from USAID, thereby exacerbating famine conditions, the right-wing military adopted a regional command structure through which it could smuggle staple commodities to win the loyalty of the rural population. In an attempt to curtail the right-wing military's increasing power, the PKI and the left-wing military formed a number of peasant and other mass organizations. Indonesia-Malaysia Confrontation in 1963, a policy of confrontation against the newly formed Federation of Malaysia was announced by the Sukarno regime. This further exacerbated the split between the left-wing and right-wing military factions, with the left-wing faction and the Communist Party taking part in guerrilla raids on the border with Malaysia, while the right-wing faction was largely absent from the conflict. The confrontation further encouraged the West to seek ways to topple Sukarno, viewed as a growing threat to Southeast Asian regional stability. The deepening of the armed conflict, coming close to all-out warfare by 1965, both increased popular dissatisfaction with the Sukarno regime and strengthened the hand of the right-wing generals whose forces were still close to the center of power in Jakarta. The collapse of guided democracy. The 30th of September movement. On the night of 30 September 1 October 1965, 6 senior army generals were kidnapped and executed in Jakarta by a battalion of soldiers from the Presidential Guard in an attempted coup. The right faction among the top generals was wiped out, including the powerful Army Chief of Staff, Ahmad Yani. Around 2,000 troops from coup groups occupied three sides of Merdeka Square, and commanded the Presidential Palace, radio station, and telecommunications center, but did not occupy the east side, site of Kostrad headquarters. Calling themselves the 30th of September movement, the group announced on radio around 7 a.m. that they were trying to stop a military coup backed by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency that was planned to remove Sukarno from power. They claimed to have arrested several generals belonging to a conspiracy, the Council of Generals, that had plotted a military coup against the government of President Sukarno. They further alleged that this coup was to take place on Army Day, with the backing of the CIA, and that the council would then install themselves as a military junta. Furthermore, the soldiers proclaimed the establishment of a revolutionary council, consisting of various well-known military officers and civilian leaders that would be the highest authority in Indonesia. Additionally, they declared President Sukarno's Twikora cabinet as invalid. According to one chief conspirator, Lt. Col. Latif, the palace guards had not attempted to kill or capture Major General Suharto, commander of Kostrad, because he was considered a Sukarno loyalist. Suharto, along with the surviving General Dissolution, made the counter-allegation that the G3OS was a rebellious movement that sought to replace President Sukarno's government with a communist government. Upon hearing of the radio announcement, Suharto and Dissolution began consolidating their forces, successfully gaining the loyalty of Jakarta Garrison Commander Maj. Gen. Umar Wirahadi Kusuma and Colonel Salwo Edi Wibowo, the commander of Army Special Forces RPKAD. During the evening of the 1st of October, RPKAD soldiers recaptured RRI and telecommunications building without any resistance as the rebel soldiers had retreated back to Halim Air Force Base. RPKAD forces proceeded to attack Halim Perdana Kusuma AF Base on the morning of the 2nd of October. but was stopped by the rebel soldiers in a fierce gun battle in which several fatalities were inflicted on both sides. On 3 October, the generals' bodies were discovered at Halim, and on 5 October a large public funeral was held. Internal military power struggle. The killing of the generals saw influence in the army fall to those more willing to stand up to Sukarno and the army's enemies on the left. After the assassinations of those generals, the highest-ranking officer in the Indonesian military, and third highest in the overall chain of command, was Defense Minister and Armed Forces Chief of Staff Gen. Abdul Haris Nasution, a member of the right-wing camp. On 2 October, Suharto accepted Sukarno's order for him to take control of the army, but on the condition that Suharto personally have authority to restore order and security. The 1st of November formation of Kopkamtib formalized this authority. However, on 5 October Sukarno moved to promote Maj. Gen. Pranoto Rekso Samudra, considered a Sukarno loyalist, to Army Chief of Staff. After the promotion, the New York Times reported that an unnamed Western diplomatic report alleged that Pranoto was a former member of the PKI. Pranoto's alleged communism, as well as his timely promotion, led them to promote the view that the PKI and Sukarno conspired to assassinate the generals to consolidate their grip on power. In the aftermath of the assassinations, however, Major Gen. Suharto and his KOSTRAD units were closest to Jakarta. By default, Suharto became the field general in charge of prosecution of the G3OS. Later, at the insistence of Gen. Abdul Haris Nasution, Pranoto was removed and Suharto was promoted to Army Chief of Staff on 14 October 1965. Anti-Communist Purge. In early October, a military propaganda campaign began to sweep the country, successfully convincing both Indonesian and international audiences that it was a communist coup, and that the murders were cowardly atrocities against Indonesian heroes. The 30th of September movement was called Gestapo. The army, acting on orders by Suharto and supervised by Nasution, began a campaign of agitation and incitement to violence among Indonesian civilians aimed at the communist community and toward President Sukarno himself. The PKI's denials of involvement had little effect. The regime was quickly destabilized, with the army the only force left to maintain order. At the funeral of Nasution's daughter Irma, Navy Commander Admiral Edi Martadinata gave Muslim leaders the signal to attack communists. On 8 October, the PKI head office was ransacked and burned to the ground while firefighters stood by idly. They then marched demanding the dissolution of the Communist Party. The homes of senior party figures, including PKI chairman D.N. Adit H. Lukman and Nyoto, were also torched. The army-led campaign to purge Indonesian society, government and armed forces of the Communist Party and other leftist organizations. Leading PKI members were immediately arrested, some summarily executed. On 18 October, a declaration was read over the army-controlled radio stations, banning the PKI. The ban included the party itself, and its youth and women's wings, peasant associations, intellectual and student groups, and the SRBSI Union. At the time, it was not clear whether this ban applied only to Jakarta, or the whole Republic of Indonesia. However, the ban was soon used as a pretext for the Indonesian army to go throughout the country carrying out extrajudicial punishments, including mass arrest and summary executions, against suspected leftists and Sukarno loyalists. As the violence spread, Sukarno issued orders to try to stop it, but he was ignored. He also refused to blame the PKI for the coup, let alone ban it as the army demanded. However, although Suharto and Nasution were increasingly suspicious about Sukarno's role in the affair, the army was reluctant to confront the president directly because of his still widespread popularity. Beginning in later October 1965, and feeding off pent-up communal hatreds, The Indonesian army and its civilian allies began to kill actual and suspected members and associates of the PKI. The U.S. government covertly supported the massacres, providing extensive lists of suspected communists to be targeted. The killings started in the capital Jakarta, spread to Central and East Java, and later Bali. Although killings occurred across Indonesia, the worst were in PKI strongholds of Central Java, East Java, Bali, and northern Sumatra. The massacres reached their peak over the remainder of the year before subsiding in the early months of 1966. The estimates of the death toll of the violence range from over 100,000 to 3 million, but most scholars accept a figure of around 500,000. Many others were also imprisoned, and for the next 10 years people were still being imprisoned as suspects. It is thought that as many as 1.5 meters were imprisoned at one stage or another. As a result of the purge, one of Sukarno's 3 pillars of support, the PKI, had been effectively eliminated by the other 2. The military and political Islam. Demonstrations in October 1965, students in Jakarta formed KAMI, which called for the banning of the PKI. It was soon joined by a host of similar organizations made up of high school students, workers, artists and laborers and the like. Other targets for the demonstrators were rising prices and government inefficiency. They also demonstrated against Subandrio, the foreign minister and head of the BPI intelligence agency and the number 2 man in the government. On 10 January 1966, demonstrators, including KAMI, demonstrated in front of the Provisional Legislature and announced what became known as the 3 demands of the people. Dissolution of the PKI, the expulsion from the cabinet of G3 ousted PKI elements, lower prices and economic improvements. In February 1966, as anti-communist demonstrations continued, Sukarno tried to placate Suharto by promoting him. On 21 February, he tried to regain the initiative by announcing a new cabinet, which included former Air Force Chief Omar Dhani, who had issued a statement on 1 October 1965 initially supporting the coup. More provocatively still, Sukarno fired General Dissolution from his cabinet post. The new cabinet immediately became known as the Gestapo Cabinet, after the acronym coined by the military for the 30th of September movement. 2 days after the announcement, a huge crowd attempted to storm the presidential palace. The next day, while the new cabinet was being inaugurated, soldiers from the Presidential Guard opened fire on a crowd in front of the palace, killing student protester Arif Rahman Hakim, who was turned into a martyr and given a hero's funeral the following day. On 8 March 1966, students managed to ransack the foreign ministry, and held it for 5 hours. They daubed slogans, one accusing Subandrio of murdering the generals, and drew graffiti showing Subandrio as a Pekingese dog or hanging from gallows. Sukarno then planned a 3-day series of meetings to restore his authority. The first, on 10 March, involved the leaders of political parties. He managed to persuade them to sign a declaration warning against the undermining of presidential authority by student demonstrations. The second stage was a cabinet meeting planned for the 11th of March. However, as this meeting was underway, word reached Sukarno that unidentified troops were surrounding the palace. Sukarno left the palace in haste for Bogor, where later that night, he signed the Supersma document transferring authority to restore order to Major General Suharto. Suharto acted quickly. On 12 March he banned the PKI. The same day, there was a show of force by the army in the streets of Jakarta, which was watched by cheering crowds. On 18 March, Subandrio and 14 other ministers were arrested, including 3rd Deputy Prime Minister Chairul Sala. That night, the radio announced that the ministers were in protective custody. Suharto later admitted in his autobiography that he frequently liaised with the student protesters throughout this period, and Sukarno often pleaded with him to stop the demonstrations.